Welcome to this second video on the historical environment study of the Norman conquest in Wales. Today we will examine the extent to which the Normans were able to conquer Wales. When I use the term Normans, I am not just referring to the kings but also to the Norman barons. The first section will examine William's pilgrimage to St. David's Shrine on the far west coast of Wales. We will then examine how the Norman barons that settled in the Marches looked to expand their territory into Wales. We will then examine the extent to which the Norman barons used terror tactics to control areas of Wales. We will finish by assessing the extent to which the Normans were able to establish control in Wales. There is much to suggest that William did not care as much about Wales as he did England. It was England that he believed was his by divine right and by the promise of Edward the Confessor. England also had more economic potential as more land was cultivated for farming. Therefore, during the first 15 years of his reign, William's main priority was to establish control of the border, known as the Marches. This is especially important since leading Anglo-Saxon Earl Edwin, the Earl of Mercia, used the Welsh Marches as a base for rebellion in the first 3 years of William's reign. However, once William had firmly established control of England, he did take an interest in Wales. In 1081, he went on a pilgrimage to St. David's, which is a cathedral city named after Wales' patron saint, St. David, who is buried there. A pilgrimage is a religious journey. William completed pilgrimages to show his devotion to the church, but also to show the people that God had chosen him to be king. However, William supposedly took an army with him on this pilgrimage, which means his intent may not have been entirely religious. He also built a small royal castle in St. David, to show his royal authority. However, he did not unleash this army on the Welsh people, so it may have been used for security and defense. William stopped in Cardiff on his return from his pilgrimage to St. David. This had a strategic advantage since it would help establish control into South Wales since Cardiff was not too far from the border. It would also establish trade routes between Wales and the south of England. This is an image of the Norman stone keep of Cardiff Castle. It was built on the site of an old Roman fort. However, there is some debate about whether it was built under William's instructions or under instruction of the Earl of Gloucester, as a way for the Earl to expand his power base into South Wales. Many Norman lords were inspired by William's expedition into Wales, and so territorial expansion followed. Throughout the 1080s and 1090s, the Norman barons sought to conquer other parts of South Wales. This resulted in the Normans settling in Pembroke and the Vale of Glamorgan. By William's death in 1086, the Normans had gained control of South Wales and there had even been some expansion westwards. There is evidence that William intended to consolidate his position in South Wales. In other words, he intended to impose long-term control since he opened up a royal mint in Cardiff. This would have established trade and commerce under his authority as king. The original 3 Marcher lords decided to focus their strength and energy on the borders. This is because they also owned land in Normandy and so Wales was a secondary priority. They only cared about Wales in terms of what economic value they could receive from it. However, under William Rufus and Henry I, the Norman lords became more aggressive. This is because a new generation sprung up that did not have a huge landed estate in Normandy and so were able to prioritize the conquest of Wales, which they considered a new frontier and a fresh opportunity to seize wealth and power. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Therefore, they used expansionist tactics. This essentially means they looked to expand their power base beyond the border and into Wales. For example, Gerald of Windsor became the royal constable of Pembroke Castle during the reign of Henry I. He was a second son, so did not inherit any land from his father, and so conducted a military campaign in South Wales in order to make his own fortune. The Norman lords undoubtedly had more superior military equipment and training. They were more disciplined too, since they used divisions and rankings within the army to ensure order. One tactic that the Normans used to great effect was the use of archers, who could fly their arrows into dense woodland in order to flush their enemy out. In contrast, however, the Welsh knew how to use the landscape to their advantage. Many were experienced at border raids. This is when they'd cross over the Anglo-Welsh border to steal goods, often livestock. The Welsh therefore used guerrilla tactics. This is when you do not have a fixed base, like the Normans with their castles, but instead used the terrain as natural cover. For example, the Welsh could use the mountain ranges in the center and the north to pose a tactical retreat. They also knew how to use the terrain to stage an ambush of their enemy. This is because they knew the roads through thick woodland and mountain ranges far better than the Normans. They would find a place where it was easy to launch a surprise attack. By the end of the Norman period, barons had established control to the south of Wales, and Cardiff had grown as a town around the castle. However, their grasp of power was weak. They had to rely on a long train of supplies leading back to England, and this was easy for the Welsh to raid, so essential supplies were often stolen. The Welsh use of guerrilla tactics also meant they could launch counterattacks easily. This meant the Normans never truly secured their position in South Wales. This is shown when Henry I died without a legitimate heir. At this point, England fell into a civil war called the Anarchy between King Stephen and Queen Matilda. During this time, the Welsh princes were able to fully regain control of Wales. Let's now examine the use of terror tactics as part of the Norman conquest of Wales. The use of terror as a control method means to use tactics that causes the native population to fear their rulers. This includes methods that would nowadays contravene the Geneva Convention since they are considered war crimes. This includes looting, which is the pillaging or stealing of valuable goods from a community. Massacres, which is the mass murder of civilians living within the occupied land, and imprisonment, rape and exploitation of the civilian population. William did not use terror as a tactic in Wales. Instead, he left the marcher lords to their own devices. It wasn't until later in the Norman period that the next generation of barons used terror as part of an expansionist policy. This is very different to William's attitude in the north of England. In 1069, he conducted what was called the Harrying of the North, where he essentially committed genocide of the people. He salted the crops in all farmland so that the crops would not grow, resulting in mass starvation in the countryside between the two cathedral towns of York and Durham. Furthermore, he instructed his Norman knights to conduct raids across the whole county, including looting, massacres, mass executions and rape. This placed the north firmly under William's control and put an end to major rebellions in the region. The only example of terror used in Wales came later in the Norman period, in Aberystwyth off the west coast of Wales. During the reign of Henry I, the last Norman king, the region of Cardigan that included Aberystwyth was given over to a Norman baron called Gilbert FitzRichard. He used terror tactics, including looting local communities, imprisoning both men and women, and selling some natives as slaves. He also imposed heavy forest laws on the native people, which prevented them from using the local woodland for timber and forage, which would have caused hardship for those who relied on the forest for resources. However, the case of Gilbert FitzRichard was an extreme example, and it was led more by the Baron himself than Henry I as king. There are also many examples of Welsh princes and Norman lords forming alliances, and this included intermarriage between the Welsh and the Norman aristocracy, which continued on after the Norman period. Let's now examine the extent to which William conquered Wales and subsequently the extent to which Wales changed as a result of the arrival of Norman barons. The biggest changes undoubtedly took place in the Marcher towns following the conquest of 1066. Towns developed around the castles, which then economically developed the area and established trade links across the border. For example, in North Wales, Hewder of Ranch, the Earl of Chester, had founded a new town in Rhuddlan. The Domesday Book shows that by 1086, Rhuddlan had grown into a small town with its own church and a mint that produced coins. There is some evidence of colonization in Wales. A country or region is colonized following an invasion when people migrate over to the newly conquered region and settle among the native people, often establishing control over them. This happened, but not to a large extent, following the Norman conquest. The vast majority of colonization took place around the Marcher towns, with very few Normans choosing to live in the countryside. This had both economic and security advantages. The economic advantages were that the new Norman population could begin to cultivate the land surrounding the castle and produce crops, which brought them wealth, but it also boosted the local economy. The defense advantage meant that if the region ever came under attack, the local population could be called upon to defend the lord and his castle. Norman barons recruited people to move to their new Marcher town who had the skills required to both boost the economy and bolster security. For example, a Flemish lord called Wiso brought over settlers from the Low Countries, what is modern-day Belgium, to colonize mid-Wales. This was a success since the Flemish settlers were not only trained knights, but they were also knowledgeable farmers. However, these advances into Wales were short-lived and did not take place straight away. For the majority of the Norman period, there was very little interaction between the native Welsh population and Norman migrants. Therefore, the example of Wiso and his Flemish settlers was the exception, not the rule. Let's now examine the reasons why the Normans were not able to fully conquer Wales. One key factor was the decline of the Marcher lords. Without their presence as strong leaders, it was easier for the Welsh to regain territories and resume their border raids. William FitzOsbern, the first Earl of Hereford, was arguably the most powerful of the three earls. However, he did not prioritize Wales, instead deciding to fight a war on the continent where he was subsequently killed in battle. His son and heir, the second Earl of Hereford, then joined the Revolt of the Earls, a rebellion of Norman barons, in 1075. After the revolt failed, he was stripped of his lands and imprisoned. Roger of Montgomery, the Earl of Shrewsbury, was able to pass on the title and land to his son when he died in 1094. However, only 4 years later, the second Earl died without a male heir. The Earl of Chester, Hugh de Avranches, outlived the other two Marcher earls and gained a formidable reputation for fighting his Welsh neighbours, which earned him the nickname Hugh the Wolf. However, his son and heir died in a shipwreck in 1120, not long after the country fell into civil war and anarchy under King Stephen. The next generation of Norman barons to occupy the Marches were more ambitious, since they did not own land in Normandy. However, their victories were short-lived. When civil war broke out in England following the death of Henry I, they were unable to hold their influence and power across two countries. Therefore, the Welsh princes took back control of the majority of Wales. Let's now return to our overarching question of, to what extent did the Normans conquer Wales? Firstly, William was able to impose some royal authority beyond the Marches when he visited Wales for a pilgrimage in 1081. Later in the Norman period, a new generation of barons had an aggressive and expansionist policy. As a result, they were able to conquer large parts of South Wales. Terror was used in Aberystwyth on the west coast of Cardiff in order to control the native population. However, terror tactics were not a main method of control in Wales, unlike in the north of England. In conclusion, the Normans were only ever able to partially control Wales. They had far more success in the south than the north, but even then the control was short-lived. The power of the three Marcher earls declined throughout the Norman period, and the second generation of barons lost large amounts of territory in Wales when civil war broke out following the death of Henry I. Thank you for watching. Tune into the next video to learn how to apply what you have learnt to an exam-style question on the Norman conquest in Wales.